Have you ever woken up next to someone you once loved, only to realize they now feel like a stranger? Their face remains familiar, their hands still known, but the eyes, those once warm and curious eyes, now look through you, as if something invisible has slowly crept between you, building an icy wall in a house that used to feel like home. That was the quiet truth for many women in the village of Sonora. A truth no one dared say aloud. Years had passed, children had grown, obligations had shrunk. And in the silence that followed routine, an uncomfortable awareness began to take root. They no longer loved their husbands. It didn't happen in a dramatic moment. No shouting, no breaking of glass. Just a slow, silent drift, as if love had packed its bags and left without saying goodbye. There was a woman named Mara. Once she had adored her husband. His laugh, his certainty, the way he reached for her hand in the dark. But now she could barely stand the sound of his breathing. Every gesture that once thrilled her now felt performative or irritating. And the most terrifying part, she couldn't explain when it started, or why. In Sonora, the marriages were still intact, the dinners still cooked, the beds still shared. But for many women, their hearts had left the room long ago. They stayed not for love, but for convenience, for duty, for fear, and often for guilt. Guilt for not feeling what they were told they should. Guilt for thinking about what life might be like with someone else. Guilt for imagining a world where they chose themselves. Mara wasn't alone. Her friend Layla admitted one evening over tea that she hadn't kissed her husband out of affection in years. "I just do it so he doesn't ask questions," she confessed, eyes downcast. These were not cold women. They were not cruel. They had simply lost the thread of connection that once held their marriages together. And the world never told them what to do next. Instead, it taught them to endure, to serve, to silence. Some of them tried to reignite the flame, taking trips, dressing up, initiating conversations. But nothing landed, nothing stuck. Because what had gone missing was not excitement, but the essence of feeling known. They began to feel like roommates, co-parents, business partners, anything but lovers. The tragedy wasn't the loss of passion, it was the erosion of presence. And still, they stayed. Because walking away meant unraveling an entire life, a family, a history. It meant becoming the one who left. So they smiled at the dinner table, laughed at the right cues, played their roles with quiet precision. But in private, they wept. They wept for the version of themselves they lost. They wept for the love that used to feel like sunlight. They wept for the days when waking up beside someone didn't feel like morning. And the deepest grief of all? Many didn't even know what they were grieving, because when love disappears without drama, without cruelty, without betrayal, it leaves no scar, just a hollow. And how do you explain an emptiness that has no name? Mara once stood in front of her bathroom mirror and whispered to her reflection, "I don't hate him, I just don't feel anything anymore." That was the moment she realized. The opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. And indifference, when it sets into a marriage, feels like watching a slow funeral that no one else knows is happening. But Mara wasn't ready to bury her heart just yet. And this story, hers and countless others, is about what happens when a woman finally stops lying to herself. What she chooses next will either resurrect her life or finally set her free. Change doesn't begin with fireworks. It begins in whispers. And in Sonora, those whispers had found refuge in kitchens, gardens, late-night porches. Between women. Women who had held their breath for too long and were finally letting it out. After her mirror confession, Mara began to notice what she'd never seen clearly before. The quiet signals of silent suffering on other women's faces. The forced smiles. The glazed eyes. The polite nods that screamed, "Please don't ask me how I'm really doing." One afternoon, Mara lingered after a community gathering. As others left, she stayed behind to help clean up, and so did Ayla. Ayla was always composed, the one who had everything together. But that day, as they packed away chairs, Ayla blurted, "I sometimes wish I'd never married. Is that horrible to say?" Mara didn't answer with advice. She just nodded, and Ayla began to cry. That was the first of many hidden conversations Mara would have in the weeks that followed. Each one unplanned, each one peeling away layers of armor. "I haven't slept beside him in months. I dread going home. I love my children, but sometimes I wonder who I am without them." These weren't complaints. They were confessions, fragments of truth escaping lips that had been sealed by fear and shame for far too long. The more Mara listened, the more she felt a deep, aching solidarity. She wasn't broken, she wasn't cold, she wasn't alone. There was a silent epidemic, women living lives that looked fine on the outside, but felt hollow within. And slowly Mara found herself becoming a quiet leader, not through speeches, but through presence, through the safety her honesty created. One evening, she hosted a small gathering. She called it a circle, not a meeting. There was no agenda, just tea, candlelight, and a space where no one had to pretend. At first the women were cautious, talking about surface things, recipes, chores, children. But then one woman asked, "Does anyone here ever feel invisible?" The room went still. Then heads began to nod, and something broke open. That night, for the first time, they spoke not as wives or mothers, but as women, as individuals, as souls with longings that hadn't been touched in years. The conversations were raw, painful, but healing. One woman, Clara, said, "I haven't made a single decision for myself in 12 years, not one." Another, Yelena, whispered, "I think I want to leave, but I'm afraid of destroying everyone's idea of who I'm supposed to be." These were not weak women. They were warriors, tired of fighting battles no one acknowledged. As the night ended, Mara didn't offer solutions. She just said, "Maybe it's time we start telling the truth, even if it's just to ourselves." That sentence stayed with every woman who heard it. It echoed in kitchens, in bedrooms, in long, silent car rides. Because truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced again. And sometimes the smallest whispers carry the greatest revolutions. Mara didn't know what would come next. She didn't have a map, but she knew the direction, toward herself. And she wasn't walking alone anymore. The hardest decisions are not shouted. They're made in silence, beneath the noise of daily life, while folding laundry or brushing one's hair. For Mara, the decision to reclaim herself didn't come with a grand announcement. There were no ultimatums, no packed bags, just a quiet shift. Subtle at first, like a door slightly ajar in a room that had long been closed. It began with her no longer pretending. She stopped laughing at jokes she didn't find funny. She stopped initiating empty conversations just to fill the silence. She stopped forcing herself to be touched when her skin recoiled. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of remembrance of the woman she used to be before she forgot. Her husband, Daniel, noticed the difference, but couldn't name it. "Mara, is something wrong?" he asked one evening as they sat across the table, half-finished dinners between them. She looked up, steady. "I don't know how to pretend anymore," she said. He blinked, confused, defensive, hurt, but she didn't apologize. For once, she chose honesty over comfort. At night, she began sleeping in the guest room, not out of spite, but peace. In that small, cold bed, Mara felt something she hadn't in years. Calm. No performance. No expectations. Just breath. She started taking walks by herself in the early mornings before anyone woke up. The streets were still. The sky gray-blue. It was in these moments she felt her mind clear, her heart begin to beat in her own rhythm again. One morning, she passed by a window display that read, "This life belongs to you." She stopped, read it again, and wept, because for so long it hadn't. It had belonged to the marriage, to the children, to the expectations of others. She had given herself away in little pieces, quietly, dutifully. And now all that remained was a shadow of a woman who once dreamed. That same week, her oldest daughter, Ellie, asked her, "Mama, are you okay? You seem different." Mara knelt down and looked into her daughter's eyes. "I'm trying to be honest," she said, "with myself, with everyone." Ellie didn't understand, not fully, but she hugged her harder than usual that night. It wasn't all graceful. Some days Mara felt selfish. Other days she felt cruel. Her husband grew distant, angry at times. Why now, he'd ask. Why after all these years? She had no clear answer, only that something in her had woken up, and it wouldn't go back to sleep. She went back to the women's circle, now a weekly ritual. Each time new faces joined. Each time the room held more truth. Clara had begun taking night classes. Ayla had asked her husband for a separate bedroom. Yelena had started therapy in secret. None of them had left their marriages yet, but all of them had left the lies. Mara stood before her bathroom mirror one evening, the same place she had once whispered her indifference, but this time she looked at her reflection with clarity, not sorrow. "You are still in there," she told herself, "and you deserve more than surviving." She didn't need a new man, a new life, or a dramatic escape. She needed her own permission to feel, to speak, to live. The next morning, she served breakfast in silence. Her husband muttered a thank you. The children argued over toast. It was all the same, and yet entirely different, because Mara was no longer invisible to herself. Later, she sat at her writing desk and penned a letter, not to leave, not to confront, but to remember. It began, "Dear me, I'm sorry it took so long to come home. There is a silence that comes after truth, not the kind born of fear or shame, but the stillness of a soul that has finally exhaled." Mara lived in that silence for weeks. She had not left, she had not made headlines, but she had shifted the axis of her life, and that changed everything. People noticed, but didn't know what they were seeing. She smiled less, but when she did, it reached her eyes. She spoke less, but when she did, it had weight. She no longer looked like someone keeping up an act. She looked like someone becoming whole. Her husband tried in his way to understand. "What do you want from me?" he asked one night, not in anger, but genuine confusion. And Mara answered, "I want to want you, but I can't want you if I can't find myself first." That sentence hung between them for days, not as an accusation, but as a plea for space, and surprisingly, he gave it. He started sleeping in the other room. They talked less, but they also fought less. The silence wasn't cold, it was contemplative, as if both were finally meeting themselves for the first time in years. Mara didn't rush to decide anything. She stopped treating her life like a problem that needed solving. Instead, she treated it like a wound that needed air. She returned to painting, a passion she had abandoned after Ellie was born. At first, the strokes were hesitant, then bolder. She painted women with hollow eyes, then women with fire behind them. One canvas showed a woman tearing off a mask. Another, a tree growing out of a woman's chest. It wasn't for display. It was for healing. One afternoon, she brought her youngest child, Noah, to the lake. They skipped rocks, laughed at the ducks, and sat in silence as the sky began to dim. Out of nowhere, Noah said, "I like you better now, Mommy." She looked over, surprised. "Why?" "Because you seem like you." That was the moment she realized this journey she had begun. It wasn't selfish. It was a gift to herself, to her children, to the world. Because when a woman reclaims herself, she teaches everyone around her to do the same. Mara kept attending the circles. More women came, some younger, some older, some still hopeful, others bruised beyond language, but all of them searching. They stopped asking each other, "What should I do?" and started asking, "What do I feel?" And slowly, the need to fix their marriages faded behind the deeper need to fix their relationships with themselves. Some women stayed, some left, some separated for a time. But the point was never the outcome. The point was choice. Real, informed, soulful choice, not coerced by tradition or shame or guilt. Mara eventually wrote a letter to her husband, not as a farewell, but as an invitation. "I don't know where this ends," she wrote, "but I know I want to begin again, not as the woman I've been pretending to be, but as myself. Can you meet me there?" He didn't answer right away, but a week later he joined her at one of the circles. He didn't speak. He just sat, listened, and for the first time in years, Mara reached for his hand, not out of habit, but hope. Because sometimes love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go of the version of yourself that couldn't breathe. And when you return to who you really are, you don't always find emptiness. Sometimes you find space. Space to rebuild something new, not perfect, not painless, but true.